In the Old Testament, one patriarch stands above all the rest in terms of his importance to the story of Israel, and he still exerts profound influence in modern-day Western culture, thousands of years later. We're talking about Moses, of course. Our religious traditions tell us that it was Moses who performed signs and wonders in the presence of the Pharaoh and his magicians, that it was Moses who inspired a nation of slaves to follow him out of captivity in Egypt and into the wilderness, that it was Moses who led those same Israelites in violent crusades against enemy tribes, and that it was Moses who gave them the laws and monotheistic principles that their society would follow for the rest of time. And yet, we now know that these stories are not literally true. The quest to find archaeological evidence for slavery in Egypt, for the sojourn in the wilderness, for the conquest of the Amorites and the Midianites, and for the institution of the law in ancient Israel has turned up nothing. Moses himself is a phantom. If none of the acts attributed to him actually happened, then who is he? How did these stories develop? What real-world situation caused the Judeans to promote Moses as the founder of their ancient nation? Although it is widely assumed that the Moses tradition must be very old, that assumption is sorely lacking in evidence. Ancient records are silent about Moses. Inscriptions, seals, and other texts from ancient Israel and Judah never mention Moses or any of the other Israelite patriarchs. Records from the Babylonian and Persian periods say nothing. The ancient coinage from the province of Yehud says nothing. The Elephantine papyri from the Persian-era Judeans and Israelites in Egypt show zero awareness of Moses and the Torah. The same goes for the Aramaic Hermopolis letters, Papyrus Amher 63, the Aramaic Padua papyri, and so on. Even if absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, the pattern gives us reason to doubt. 50 years ago, it was daring to suggest that Moses was not a historical individual. Today, it is daring to suggest that our stories about Moses developed as late as the Hellenistic period. Yet, that seems to be the direction scholarship is heading. If you're open to new ideas, join us as we examine the oldest known stories of Moses and present an alternate view based on that evidence. The dating of the Hebrew Bible is a topic that remains unresolved. Many traditions and myths found among its pages are old indeed, but the text itself did not reach its final form until the Hellenistic period. If this claim is false, it should not be hard to disprove. A single manuscript find could change everything. But we're not holding our breath. Dr. Gad Barnea, a historian at the University of Haifa, after examining every surviving Jewish document from the Persian period, recently stated that there is literally zero evidence for any knowledge of and any familiarity with the Bible at that time. We may not know how far back the stories of Abraham, Moses, Joshua, Deborah, David, Solomon, Esther, Daniel, and other Bible heroes go. All we can say is that no one seems to have written anything down about them until after Alexander the Great and his empire introduced Greek literature, philosophy, and culture to the Near East. So what about Moses? We mainly know of Moses from the books of the Pentateuch. The book of Deuteronomy is thought to tell the oldest version of his story, with Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers being later accretions. The story they tell is filled with improbable and fantastic elements, not to mention historical anachronisms and internal contradictions that indicate a work of creative literature. When we look at the rest of the Bible, references to Moses are surprisingly rare. The book of Ezekiel does not mention him even once. In Isaiah, only the final section known as Trito Isaiah, written long after the rest of the book, mentions Moses. In Jeremiah, Moses appears just once. He is absent from the old prophetic books of Amos and Hosea, as well as Obadiah, Jonah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, and Zechariah. Micah and Malachi have one mention each in passages that are arguably late and perhaps Hellenistic. Broadly speaking, the earlier the text, the less important Moses is. In the Hellenistic period, we begin to find references to Moses outside the Bible. These references, however, only add to our uncertainty, because if the Pentateuch was well known by that point, we would expect such stories to follow it closely. Instead, they diverge greatly from the narrative of the Pentateuch. If those authors did not learn of Moses from Jewish writings, then where did their knowledge come from? Some years ago, Old Testament professor Philip R. Davies urged caution about treating the canonical Bible as superior to other traditions. We do not know the date and origin of the canonized story or its sources, and thus we cannot assume either that it constitutes the standard version by which to judge the conformity or deviation of other accounts. Let's examine those divergent Moses traditions, guided by the work of modern critical scholars, and see where they lead us. Since we're diving into the legendary figure of Moses in this documentary, it's the perfect time to introduce today's sponsor, Bart Ehrman's courses on Christian origins. If you find Moses intriguing, you'll love Dr. Bart Ehrman's fascinating online course, Finding Moses. Ever wondered if Moses was a real historical figure or just a legendary character? Dr. Ehrman explores this and more. Exodus, truth or myth? What does the evidence actually reveal? Who penned the pivotal books, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy? When were these stories written and by whom? The Ten Commandments decoded, were they meant for just Jews or did they extend to Christians too? The Exodus, a historical event, is there any solid evidence that the Exodus occurred or that millions of Israelites wandered the wilderness for 40 years? Inconsistencies in Scripture. Are Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy really in harmony? Or do they contradict each other? Legalism in ancient Israel. Did Jews need to follow all the laws given to Moses to achieve salvation? Moses is one of history's most iconic figures. Understanding him is crucial. Don't miss out on this deep dive into the Bible's texts. Sign up at bartehrman.com/myth by clicking the link in the description or the pinned comment to start taking the course right now. Use the exclusive coupon code MYTH at checkout for a special discount. And remember, once you sign up, you own the course for life. Now, let's get back to our hunt for the true origins of Moses in this documentary. Hecataeus of Abdera was a Greek historian who lived during the 4th century BCE. His book on Egypt, called Aegyptiaca, contains the earliest datable references to Moses that we know of. It was probably written between 320 and 315 BCE. The book survives only in fragments quoted in another work, Bibliotheca Historica by Diodorus Siculus, a historian of the 1st century BCE. Those passages are preserved in turn by the writing of Photius, a 9th century patriarch of the Orthodox Church. So we're dealing with quotations of Hecataeus. Furthermore, as several recent scholars have recognized, Diodorus's quotations of Hecataeus appear to be mixed with material from another source, possibly the biography of Pompey, written by Theophanes of Mytilene in the 1st century BCE. Pompey was the general who captured Jerusalem and looted the Jewish temple in 63 BCE. For this section, we will follow the analysis of Russell Gamirkin for distinguishing between the material from these two authors. Another well-known scholar, Daniel Schwartz, ascribes less of the material to Hecataeus than Gamirkin does, but that would not affect our conclusions in this video. In Book 1, Diodorus quotes the following passage from Hecataeus about how the Egyptians were the founders of many colonies around the world. Now, the Egyptians say that also after these events, a great number of colonies were spread from Egypt all over the inhabited world. To Babylon, for instance, the colonists were led by Belus, who was held to be the son of Poseidon and Libya. And after establishing himself on the Euphrates River, he appointed priests called Chaldeans by the Babylonians. They say those who set forth with Danaus, likewise from Egypt, settled what is practically the oldest city of Greece, Argos, and that the nation of the Colchis in Pontus and that of the Jews, which lies between Arabia and Syria, were founded as colonies by certain immigrants from their country. This is the reason why it is a long-established institution among these two peoples to circumcise their male children, the custom having been brought over from Egypt. This idea that many of the world's nations were colonies of Egypt, though not at all true, is an important element in the development of the Moses story. In Book 40 of Bibliotheca Historica, Diodorus recounts the Roman war against Judea, and he begins by explaining to his readers who the Jews are. Quoting Hecataeus, he says the following: "The colony of Judea was headed by a man named Moses, outstanding both for his wisdom and courage. On taking possession of the land, he founded, besides other cities, one that is now the most renowned of all, called Jerusalem. In addition, he established the temple that they hold in chief veneration, instituted their forms of worship and ritual, drew up the laws relating to their political institutions, and ordered them." Although this sounds superficially like the Moses of the Bible, none of the details are the same. Whatever Hecataeus' source for this legend about Moses was, it was not the book of Exodus. Hecataeus knows nothing of the captivity of the Jews, of Moses' role as a deliverer, or of the wonders performed by Moses and Aaron. According to Hecataeus, Moses did not die in the wilderness, but went all the way to Jerusalem, where he personally founded the city, its temple, and Judea's political institutions. Moses is clearly regarded as a lawgiver, but not in connection with the books of the Torah. Gamirkin observes, "By the time of Hecataeus, we may begin to speak of the laws of Moses. One cannot yet speak of the books of Moses." Now, Hecataeus visited Thebes in person in order to write his book on Egyptian history that Diodorus is quoting from. Gamirkin suggests the possibility that Hecataeus learned about Moses the lawgiver from the priests in Egypt, and drew his own conclusion that Moses had also been the founder of Jerusalem, since this was the typical pattern in Greek-founded legends. Next, Diodorus says the following about Moses. He also divided the people into 12 tribes, since this is regarded as the most perfect number, and corresponds to the number of months that make up a year. Again, this might sound like an allusion to the Pentateuch, but the details don't line up. Hecataeus knows nothing about the story of Jacob and his 12 sons. Rather, he seems to be drawing on the Greek stereotype of 12 tribe alliances being the perfect political structure. For example, Plato, in Book 5 of Laws, describes the ideal country as one that is comprised of 12 territories and 12 tribes. The city shall be placed in a suitable situation, as nearly as possible in the center of the country, and shall be divided into 12 wards. 12 lots will be assigned to 12 gods, and they will give their names to the tribes. The divisions of the city shall correspond to those of the country. The 12 tribes shall allot among themselves annually the 12 divisions of the country, and each tribe shall appoint 5 wardens and commanders of the watch. Plato goes on to give further instructions regarding the 12 tribes, and he also explains that 12 is the ideal number because there are 12 months. In other words, this detail about Moses establishing 12 tribes due to the 12 months of the year more likely comes from Plato and Greek ideals rather than the Jewish scriptures. It would not be surprising for a Greek writer to assume that Moses, as a wise lawgiver, must have divided his country into 12 tribes. The next remarks by Diodorus appear to come from Theophanes of Mytilene instead of Hecataeus. Diodorus states, "But Moses had no images whatsoever of the gods made for them, being of the opinion that God is not in human form. Rather, the heaven that encompasses the earth is alone divine and rules everything." As we noted, Theophanes, who lived 300 years after Hecataeus, had written a book about the Roman general Pompey. The fact that the Jerusalem temple contained no images or statues of any kind was not widely known until Pompey ransacked the temple and found it empty. Thus, when Diodorus says that Moses put no images in the temple, his source must be later than Pompey's invasion. Next, Diodorus states that Moses instituted an antisocial and hostile religion due to the Judeans' expulsion from Egypt. This statement is incompatible with the early quotation of Hecataeus that said Moses was highly esteemed and that Judea was founded by Egyptians. Again, this must come from a later source than Hecataeus. Diodorus' next statement is plausibly from Hecataeus. Moses picked out the men of most refinement and with the greatest ability to head the entire nation, and appointed them priests, and he ordained that they should occupy themselves with the temple and the honors and sacrifices offered to their God. These same men he appointed to be judges in all major disputes, and entrusted to them the guardianship of the laws and customs. As before, the details here don't really align with the Pentateuch, but they are typical of Greek foundation stories. Diodorus goes on to explain that the Judeans never have a king and are instead ruled by a priest. Gamirkin believes this comes from Theophanes, who was justifying Pompey's abolition of the short-lived Maccabean monarchy in favor of rule by the Judean high priest. After this, Diodorus quotes a paraphrase of Deuteronomy 28:69. "These are the words that Moses heard from God and declares to the Jews." Gamirkin believes that this also comes from Theophanes. It would be strange for Hecataeus to quote from a book that he has systematically contradicted on every detail. To summarize so far, our earliest source on Moses is Hecataeus of Abdera, who probably wrote between 320 and 315 BCE. According to Hecataeus, Jerusalem was colonized by Egyptians under their ruler Moses, who was famous for his wisdom and courage. Moses founded the Jerusalem temple, instituted its laws, and divided Judea into 12 tribes in accordance with Plato's political philosophy. This story has echoes in the Pentateuch, yet nearly every detail differs from what the Bible actually says, and much of it is plausibly invented by Hecataeus himself. His actual knowledge about the Jews was meager. He shows no awareness of the Pentateuch or its contents. Our surviving fragments of Hecataeus are mixed with details taken from a later historian, probably Theophanes of Mytilene, who was writing almost 3 centuries later. Theophanes' knowledge of Moses and the Jerusalem temple come from his time as part of Pompey's entourage in 63 BCE, and he knows at least one quote attributable to Deuteronomy. Unlike Hecataeus, Theophanes had a rather negative view of the Jews, viewing their religious practices as deviant and hostile toward outsiders, and he doesn't view the Judeans as being Egyptian. We'll find out why in a bit. This brief outline of Moses' life remained influential for several centuries, even after the Pentateuch became widely available. Strabo's famous Geographica, first published in 7 BCE, states that Moses was an Egyptian priest who led a large group of thoughtful men to take over the humble city of Jerusalem. There, he established a place of worship and was reputed as a great leader. By the way, the quotations attributed to Hecataeus of Abdera by Josephus will not be covered here, because scholars have shown them to be a later pseudonymous forgery. That author, whoever he was, is now referred to as pseudo-Hecataeus by historians. The late Israeli Bible professor Moshe Weinfeld pointed out in a 1988 paper that although most genres of biblical literature have Near Eastern counterparts, the stories about patriarchs who settle Israel and establish its cities do not. Colonization and foundation stories, however, were a popular genre in the Greek world. Weinfeld identifies several narrative elements common in these Greco-Roman myths and shows how the same elements can be found in the Bible. For example, such stories typically start with a man who leaves a great civilization charged with a universal mission. Aeneas, for example, leaves the famous city of Troy and founds Alba Longa, the leader of the Latin League. Aeneas' descendants, Romulus and Remus, later found the city of Rome. Abraham is one prime example put forth by Weinfeld, But the tradition of Moses as an Egyptian who founds Jerusalem fits just as well, if not better. According to Weinfeld, Moses resembles both Romulus, the legendary settler of Rome, and Numa, the successor of Romulus, who established Rome's religious and political institutions. In a separate study, Catherine M. Stott has noticed that Livy's claim that the laws of Numa were discovered in his grave centuries later sounds a lot like the discovery of the laws of Moses in 2 Kings 22. Weinfeld also notes the remarkable parallels between the birth legends of Romulus and Remus on the one hand and Moses on the other. However, he stops short of explaining how it is that Greek myth genres and narrative patterns show up all over the Pentateuch, other than to say that petty states in the eastern Mediterranean were formed under similar conditions to the Greek city-states. Gamirkin goes further than Weinfeld, especially in his 2016 book, Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible, where he argues that Jewish foundation stories are dependent on and inspired by the Greek catesis, the foundation story genre. He writes, "The story of the migration of the Israelites to the Promised Land under the leadership of Moses and his creation of a constitution and laws for the new nation closely conform to the conventions of the Greek foundation story. A story of the Jewish nation written by a Greek historian might have read much as the present text of Exodus to Joshua." Gamirkin also notes that the Jews living in Alexandria, the cosmopolitan Egyptian city where the Septuagint was produced, would have had access to a wide variety of current Greek literature through the Great Library of Alexandria. Now, let's look at some more Hellenistic Moses myths. Manetho was an Egyptian priest in the 3rd century BCE and a prolific writer of books in Greek. Around the year 285 BCE, a few decades after Hecataeus, he wrote a history of Egypt called the Aegyptiaca that was well known in antiquity. In fact, Manetho's innovation of dividing the Egyptian pharaohs into dynasties is still used by historians today. Though his work is invaluable to Egyptologists, it is also filled with myths and historical errors. Manetho wrote at least 2 stories about ancient foreigners being expelled from Egypt that are relevant to the Moses tradition. Though the originals are lost, the 1st century Jewish historian Josephus quoted from them in his work titled Against Apion, which was written to defend Judaism as a classical religion and philosophy. The first story is about the expulsion of the Hexos from ancient Egypt. At first glance, this might seem irrelevant to the story of Moses, but there are important parallels we will point out. We should start by explaining who the Hexos were. The 15th dynasty of Egypt consisted of several non-Egyptian kings, Canaanites most likely, who ruled over Lower Egypt for about a century, from 1650 to 1550 BCE. They were known in Egyptian as the Hecataeus, which meant kings from foreign lands. This phrase later evolved into the Greek word Hexos. In the end, these foreign rulers were expelled from Egypt by Pharaoh Ahmose I, and this event is the subject of Manetho's first story. Manetho is extremely critical of the Hexos, saying they burnt Egyptian cities and razed its temples to the ground. He also says they treated the Egyptians cruelly, killing some and enslaving others. According to Gamirkan, Manetho's coloring of the Hexos legend actually reflects the poor treatment of Egyptians by the Persians, especially Artaxerxes III, who lived much closer to Manetho's time. Around the year 340 BCE, Artaxerxes invaded Egypt, destroyed the walls of its cities, looted its temples, and instituted a reign of terror lasting 10 years. There are two important parallels with the Moses story to note here: the theme of foreigners in Egypt and the theme of enslavement. Manetho states that the Hyksos king Salitis established a stronghold in the city of Varus, which historically was indeed the Hyksos capital. He then explains the meaning of the name Hexos, only he gets the explanation wrong. He says the name means shepherd kings, when it actually means foreign kings. Later, he offers an alternate translation of Hexos, shepherd captives. This too is wrong. Turning to the Pentateuch, we are told in both the Joseph story and the Moses story that the Israelites in Egypt inhabited a place called Goshen, separate from the other Egyptians. Genesis 46:34 explains that this is because the Egyptians had great hatred for shepherds. Historically, this claim is utterly incorrect. Even in the Bible, the Egyptians themselves are shepherds. See Exodus 9 verse 3. And Egyptian inscriptions often tell of desert tribes taking refuge with their flocks in Egypt. This statement in Genesis can only be referring to the hatred of Egyptians toward the Hyksos, but that is incredibly odd, because it means the author of Genesis has the same misunderstanding about the Hyksos that Manetho has. To restate the issue, the claim in Genesis that the Egyptians hated shepherds makes no sense on its own. In light of Manetho's hate for the Hyksos and his claim that they were shepherds, Genesis suddenly makes sense as a veiled reference to the Hyksos, but only if the author was familiar with Manetho or a very similar source that incorrectly equated the Hyksos with shepherds. Now, Manetho makes a big deal about the Hyksos capital at Avaris and says the Hyksos shepherds built a great wall around the region. It turns out the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived according to Genesis and Exodus, was probably the region around Avaris. Gamirkan points out that on their way out of Egypt, the Israelites passed by the wilderness of Shur, which means wall in Hebrew. Manetho continues that Pharaoh Thutmose besieged Avaris and expelled the Hyksos. He writes, "No fewer than 240,000 entire households with their possessions left Egypt and traversed the desert to Syria. There, terrified by the might of the Assyrians, they, the Hyksos, built a city in the country now called Judea, capable of accommodating their vast company, and gave it the name of Jerusalem." This large number of Hyksos households and its specificity bring to mind the 600,000 Israelites that leave Egypt in the Exodus story. It's important to be clear here. The Israelites were not the Hyksos, and the timeline of the Hyksos dynasty is incompatible with the biblical chronology of the Israelite sojourn in Egypt. Moreover, Manetho is not saying the Hyksos were Jews. Rather, he is saying that Judea and the city of Jerusalem were founded by the Hyksos. This story has a lot in common with Hecataeus' story, that Jerusalem was founded by Egyptians. Gamirkan suggests that Manetho, an Egyptian priest, was correcting Hecataeus. No, says Manetho, the Jews are not Egyptians. They descend from foreigners who were driven out of Egypt. To summarize Manetho's first story about the Hexos, he describes the century of Hexos rule in terms influenced by the more recent Persian conquest of Egypt. He mistakenly says their name meant shepherd kings, and says that when they were expelled from Egypt, they settled in Judea and founded Jerusalem. This is relevant to the emerging Moses tradition for two reasons. One, there are numerous thematic parallels in Genesis and Exodus that are hard to explain unless the Pentateuch authors use Manetho as a source. And two, Manetho seems to be correcting the legend told by Hecataeus about who founded Jerusalem. Hecataeus says it was Egyptians led by Moses, but Manetho, writing a few decades later, says it was the Hexos who were foreign shepherds. It's important to emphasize that Manetho shows no knowledge of any Jewish tradition or scriptures in this story. The second story told by Manetho and preserved by Josephus is even more intriguing. This one takes place, according to Manetho's chronology, some 500 years later, and it concerns an Egyptian king named Amenophis. As Manetho's story goes, King Amenophis of Egypt wants to have a vision of the gods. His seer tells him he will see the gods if he purges Egypt of lepers and other polluted people. Amenophis does, as he is told, sending 80,000 disabled people and lepers to work in the stone quarries east of the Nile. However, the seer also warns that these polluted men will join forces with an enemy and become the masters of Egypt for 13 years. Having put that warning in writing, the seer kills himself. After some time, King Amenophis allows the polluted men to inhabit the abandoned city of Avaris, a city dedicated to the god Seth Typhon since the time of the original Hexos. Once established in Avaris, those men appoint a leprous priest from Heliopolis named Osarsiph to be their leader. Under Osarsiph, they abandon the traditional Egyptian gods and prepare for war against King Amenophis. Let's stop here and point out that this story is fictional. However, according to Gamirkan, it served an important political purpose: to criticize the revival of the Seth cult under the Ramesside kings. Seth, the god of the desert, was an Egyptian deity who became equated with the Syrian storm god Hadad during the reign of the Hexos. The cult of Seth continued to flourish in Avaris even after the expulsion of the Hexos. But in Manetho's time, it was highly demonized for its association with foreign invaders. Manetho's goal was to show that the cult had been founded by polluted priests from the beginning. Propaganda that links evil foreigners with the Seth Typhon cult is explicit in another Hellenistic Egyptian text called the Oracle of the Potter. Written around the time of Manetho, it purports to be an ancient prophecy given to Amenophis. It predicts a time of drought, a darkening of the sun, and other hardships that will only end when foreigners and their religion are expunged from Egypt. It also predicts that when that time comes, Alexandria, the city of foreigners will be abandoned. Continuing Manetho's story, the rebels send an embassy to Jerusalem, inviting the Hexos shepherds to come fight against Egypt. Some 200,000 shepherds answer the call and come to Avaris, and King Amenophis remembers the seer's warning. He gathers an army to confront the rebels, but then changes his mind and retreats to Ethiopia. This purely fictional story is an allegory for King Nectanebos II, who similarly fled to Ethiopia when Artaxerxes III invaded. According to Manetho, these rebels and their Hexos allies set fire to the cities of Egypt, pillaged the temples, and mutilated the statues of the gods. Manetho then, as an aside, says that according to Egyptian gossip about the Jews, this priest, Osirisif, was the same person as Moses. He also says there is much more Egyptian gossip about the Jews that he will not discuss. We can assume it was not good gossip. To summarize, Manetho's second story is about the return of the Hexos from Jerusalem to Egypt, where they joined forces with leprous priests to pillage Egypt and its temples. It is not a historical event, but an allegorical tale about the reign of terror under Artaxerxes III and the impious foreign cult of Seth Typhon. However, by Manetho's time, this backlash against foreigners might have included the Jews, and some Egyptians were spreading gossip that equated Moses with Osirisif, the priest from Heliopolis. Manetho himself does not appear to know anything about Moses or Judea beyond what could be found in Hecataeus' earlier account. In his daring 2006 book, Gamirkin made the proposal that the biblical Exodus story was created as a response to slander about the Jews that was circulating in the 3rd century BCE. According to this slander, the Jews were descendants of the hated Hexos, and their leader Moses had been a renegade priest from Heliopolis. In essence, the Exodus story turns the tables, making the Jews the victims rather than the oppressors. It acknowledges the Hexos link by placing the Jews around Avaris and blaming the Egyptians for their hatred of shepherds. It casts the Jews in the role of slaves that is filled by the polluted people in Manetho. And it presents the Jews as pious followers of Yahweh rather than Seth Typhon. Earlier layers of the biblical story even say that the Jews were expelled from Egypt, while later layers change this expulsion to an escape that the Pharaoh was opposed to. There are other parallels with the Exodus story that must also be noted. The Pentateuch has 2 strange references to leprosy. One is in Exodus 4, where Moses is able to turn his hand leprous and heal it as a sign to Pharaoh. The other is the story of Miriam being briefly stricken with leprosy as God's punishment for rebellion in Numbers 12. Both stories are plausibly intended to subvert the charge that all the Jews of Egypt had been lepers. Renowned Old Testament scholar Thomas Romer agrees with this interpretation, and he thinks Manetho's story is reflected in Deuteronomy 7:15 as well. All the dread diseases from Egypt that you experienced, Yahweh will not inflict on you. Romer says, the biblical redactor opposes to the tradition of the lepers known by Manetho the affirmation that Moses' leprosy was only momentary. It happened in the context of a transfer of divine powers to him. Another scholar, J. Ruckel, has argued that the statement by the Pharaoh in Exodus 1:10 is based on the Manetho tradition. In this verse, the Pharaoh declares, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us, and get them up out of the land." The idea that Israel might join forces with Egypt's enemies is a blind motif that is abandoned in the rest of the Exodus story. However, it is a close parallel to the part of Manetho's story in which the seer predicts that the polluted priests will join forces with Egypt's enemies. Lastly, Philip R. Davies has noted that the obscure term Hasafsuf, which seems to refer to an entity traveling with the Israelites in Numbers 11:4, could be related to the name Osarsif from the Manetho tradition. So the idea that parts of the Exodus story are dependent on the Hexos tradition promoted by Manetho in the early 3rd century is already mainstream scholarship. Gamirkin simply goes a bit further in proposing that the main framework of the Exodus story is post-Manetho. Davies agrees that the conventional explanation that Hecataeus and Manetho knew a garbled version of the Jewish Exodus story is not necessarily correct. It remains possible that the narratives of Hecataeus and Manetho are a garbled form of the Judean story of an Exodus, in which the plagues, the name of Moses, and the departure of a group of people towards Judah have been transformed. But it is equally possible that the opposite is true, and that the story of the plagues and the transformation of an expulsion into a miraculous escape is a Judean revision of an older Egyptian story known to Hecataeus and Manetho. Sometime after 250 BCE, a Jewish writer named Artapanus, who most likely resided in Alexandria, Egypt, wrote a book called Concerning the Jews. This book has not survived, but summaries by the Greek scholar Alexander Polyhistor were preserved by some church fathers. Artapanus relates several traditions about Moses that are not found in the Pentateuch. A variant of these traditions is also known to Josephus, who does not cite Artapanus. In the surviving fragments of Artapanus' story, Moses was adopted by an Egyptian woman named Meris, who was betrothed to an Egyptian ruler named Chenephrus. Moses grows up to be a brilliant inventor and philosopher. He also divides Egypt into 36 departments and sets aside land for the priests. Chenephrus grows jealous of the admiration that the Egyptians have for Moses, so he sends Moses with an army of farmers to fight the Ethiopians, who are threatening Egypt, hoping that Moses will die in the process. En route to the Ethiopians, Moses founds the city of Hermopolis and consecrates the ibis there. Then Moses fights the Ethiopians for 10 years, but eventually befriends them and teaches them circumcision. Later, Chenephrus hires an assassin to kill Moses while he is attending the burial of his adopted mother. Moses learns of the plot and buries her in secret at a city that he names Meroe. After this, Moses flees to Arabia, where he lives with the chieftain Raguel and marries Raguel's daughter. Josephus' version contains the same general narrative and elements, but the details are somewhat different. Moses' mother is named Thermuthis, and Moses is put in charge of Pharaoh's regular army, not farmers. In this version, Moses has not found Hermopolis. However, he cleverly uses ibises to fend off dangerous flying serpents that block the way to the Ethiopian army. By traveling over land with these ibises, he is able to take the Ethiopians by surprise. He defeats their army and drives them back to their stronghold, a city called Meroe. As Moses nears the walls of the city, the Ethiopian king's daughter, named Tharbis, sees Moses and falls in love with him. He agrees to marry her as long as she hands the city over to him. Although Artapanus is assumed to have known the Pentateuch in its Greek translation, the Septuagint, his story diverges greatly from it. In his understanding, the Jews are the kin of Abraham who remain in Egypt when Abraham returns to Syria. And Moses comes along just one generation later. Only after Moses' campaign in Ethiopia does the king of Egypt begin to persecute the Jews. After this, Artapanus' story of Moses begins to resemble the biblical story of the Exodus more closely, albeit with major omissions. There is no death of the firstborn, for example. Instead, the king releases the Jews after a plague of hail and earthquakes that destroys all the Egyptian houses and temples. Was Artapanus actually familiar with the Pentateuch, or does his knowledge reflect an earlier incomplete form of those stories? According to Thomas Romer, the tradition of Moses as a conqueror is borrowed from the legend of Sesostris, a mythical king of Egypt, who was written about by Herodotus, Diodorus Siculus, and Strabo. According to legend, Sesostris was a brilliant leader who organized Egypt into departments. He was also a great strategist and waged war against Ethiopia, and was accompanied by his wife on his return. Herodotus also mentions a cult dedicated to the ibis because of their ability to repel the winged snakes of the desert. Some late elements of the Pentateuch may be based on this Moses legend. The plague of seraph serpents in Numbers 21 in particular echoes the flying serpents encountered by Moses in Ethiopia. And in both cases, it is Moses' ingenuity that saves the day. The strange mention of Moses marrying an Ethiopian woman in Numbers 12 is probably derived from the legend of Moses marrying the Ethiopian king's daughter. Including this detail in the Moses story might have been especially meaningful to the Judean diaspora living in Elephantine, near the Ethiopian frontier during the Hellenistic era. A fairy tale-like story about Moses' birth is told in Exodus 2. Here is a summary. An unnamed Levite man marries a Levite woman who gives birth to a baby boy. She hides him for 3 months, then puts him in a reed basket coated with bitumen and pitch, and she places it among the reeds of the river bank. The boy's sister, also unnamed, watches at a distance. When the Pharaoh's daughter comes to bathe, she sees the basket and sends her maid to bring it. They discover the child, which the princess realizes must be Hebrew. The baby's sister offers to go fetch a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. When the princess agrees, she brings the child's mother. The princess names the child Moses because he was drawn out of the water. The legendary birth story of Moses has many, many parallels in ancient literature. The most widely cited parallel is the birth legend of Sargon of Akkad, known from Neo-Assyrian tablets. My mother was a high priestess, My father I knew not. My high priestess mother conceived me. In secret she bore me. She set me in a basket of rushes. With bitumen she sealed my lid. She cast me into the river, which rose over me. The river bore me up and carried me to Aki, the drawer of water. Aki, the drawer of water, took me as his son and reared me. Aki, the drawer of water, appointed me as his gardener. While I was a gardener, Ishtar granted me her love, and for 4 and, it breaks up, years, I exercised kingship. It is hard to deny the similarities with the reed basket coated with bitumen and the river in particular, and this legend was probably well known throughout antiquity. However, there are other details in the Moses legend that appear in Hellenistic myth. One such myth is the birth of Heracles. In that story, Alcmene is impregnated by Zeus and gives birth to Heracles. But she fears the wrath of Hera, Zeus's wife, so she abandons Heracles in a field. Athene, Heracles' sister, rescues him and takes him to Hera, who agrees to nurse the child without knowing who the child actually is. However, the child sucks so strongly during nursing that he hurts Hera. So Athena takes the child back to his mother, Alcmene, to nurse him. Another interesting parallel, identified by Dr. Bruce Loudon, a specialist in Greek myth, comes from Ion, a Greek play by Euripides that was written between 414 and 412 BCE. In that tale, the woman Creusa gives birth to a boy after being raped by Apollo. To conceal his birth, she abandons him in a wicker cradle with 2 snakes as guardians. Hermes retrieves the infant and his cradle and places them on the steps of the Oracle of Delphi, where a priestess discovers the baby and decides to raise him. The boy grows up to be Ion, progenitor of the Ionians, and he is even named on the basis of a pun, much like Moses. This story motif was widespread in Hellenistic times. Classicist Dr. Iona Karamanou remarks in a recent book, "The exposure of a hero as a baby, his miraculous survival, and eventual restoration to his proper status constitute a common tale pattern found with a degree of variation in a wide range of Greek and non-Greek sources. This pattern is represented, for instance, in the well-known tales of Jason, Cyrus, Erichthonius, Romulus, and Remus, as well as the story of Oedipus, Ion, Telephus, Alexandros, Hippothyon, Amphion and Zethus, Neleus and Peleus, Aeolus and Boeotus. Holly, in particular, associated the seclusion and ordeal in the floating chest with rites of consecration of the young hero and his mother. Their miraculous rescue seems to demonstrate the child's divine election and predestination, as well as his mother's innocence. It's also interesting that Moses' sister is not named in Exodus 2. As Propp observes in his highly regarded commentary on Exodus, Miriam, as the sister of Moses, developed as a separate tradition. Miriam is Moses' kinswoman in the E source and his sibling in the P source, but she is non-existent in the J source. Moses' birth story with his unnamed parents and guardian sister seems to be an unconnected legend inspired by the multitude of Greek hero exposure myths that were around during the Hellenistic era.
Thank you.
Let's circle back to the early Hellenistic tradition that Moses was the founder of Jerusalem. This tradition actually survives in the Bible as well. In a paper many decades ago, G.W. Ahlstrom pointed out that Samuel's farewell speech in 1 Samuel 12, which describes all the great works of Yahweh in Israel's history, states that Moses himself brought the Israelites into their homeland. When Jacob went into Egypt, and the Egyptians oppressed them, then your ancestors cried to Yahweh, and Yahweh sent Moses and Aaron, who brought forth your ancestors out of Egypt and settled them in this place. That Moses remained in the wilderness while Joshua led the Israelites into Canaan. 2. It shows no awareness of the conquest of Canaan. 3. If this tradition knew of any glorious conquest, it should have been included among Yahweh's mighty deeds. 4. It mentions no promise of the land, even though the promise to Abraham is a major part of the Pentateuch's narrative. Ahlstrom concludes then that the tradition of Moses leading the people from Egypt into the land of Israel was older than the tradition of conquest under Joshua. Ahlstrom's purpose for pointing this out is to show that the conquest narrative has no historical basis. For our purposes here, it supports the thesis that the legend of Moses, the colonizer of Judea, as recorded by Hecataeus, was the bedrock on which the later Moses traditions were built. As for Joshua, Ahlstrom suggests he was a local hero of one of the hill country clans that formed Israel. Only later was he associated with Moses and connected with the emerging conquest tradition. We suggest that the Joshua of 1 Chronicles 7:27, who is a 9th generation descendant of Ephraim, is the original Joshua. That Joshua has a father named Nun, just as in the Pentateuch. But Chronicles tells us that the land of Ephraim was settled by Ephraim himself. In this older tradition, Joshua never grew up in Egypt or conquered Canaan. Source criticism of the Pentateuch also supports the idea that the Jews originally envisioned Moses himself as the one who led the Israelites to Jerusalem. In a recent paper, Łukasz Niishiwowski-Spano points out that the passages written by the earlier J source do not mention the wilderness period as a punishment from God. The key passage is Exodus 17, where Moses strikes the rock at Meribah to produce water for the complaining Israelites. The people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test Yahweh?" But the people thirsted there for water. And the people complained against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to Yahweh, "What shall I do for this people? They are almost ready to stone me." Yahweh said to Moses, "Go on ahead of the people and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile and go. I will be standing there in front of you on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it, so that the people may drink." Moses did so. In the sight of the elders of Israel, he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and tested Yahweh, saying, "Is Yahweh among us or not?" This passage is later rewritten in Numbers 20, and it is there God tells Moses and Aaron they will not be allowed to enter the promised land. The people quarreled with Moses and said, "Why have you brought the assembly of Yahweh into this wilderness for us and our livestock to die here?" Then Moses and Aaron went away from the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting. They fell on their faces, and the glory of Yahweh appeared to them. Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and your brother Aaron, and command the rock before their eyes to yield its water. Thus you shall bring water out of the rock for them. Thus you shall provide drink for the congregation and their livestock." So Moses took the staff from before Yahweh, as he had commanded him. Then Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their livestock drank. But Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me to show my holiness before the eyes of the Israelites, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. These are the waters of Meribah, where the Israelites quarreled with Yahweh, and through which he showed himself to be holy." We are clearly dealing with the same story, and it even occurs at the same location. But the punishment of Moses staying behind has been added as a new element. The presence of Aaron is also new. In another old passage called the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15, Moses and the Israelites sing, "You brought them in and planted them on the mountain of your own possession, the place, O Yahweh, that you made your abode, the sanctuary, O Yahweh, that your hands have established." This is an obvious reference to the Jerusalem temple, and it is clearly linked to Moses here. Its inclusion implies an early stage of the narrative where Moses is supposed to have led the Israelites to Jerusalem and established the temple there. Yet another passage connecting Moses with the temple is 2 Kings 18, which tells us that before Hezekiah's time, there was a bronze serpent in the temple made by Moses. It was called Nehushtan, and the Israelites worshipped it. We now associate this object with the story of the poisonous serpent sent by Yahweh in Numbers 21. But that story certainly did not exist in the 8th century BCE, nor does 2 Kings actually mention it. The most we can say for now is that in 2 Kings 18, Moses is directly linked with the temple. It is a well-established fact of biblical scholarship that the stories of Moses in the Bible do not depict literal history. These stories, like the rest of the Pentateuch, evolved and grew over time, and the final form of the Pentateuch contains numerous sources and layers that have been skillfully combined by editors. We still don't know when the final redaction of the Pentateuch was produced or how most of its stories developed. Though scholars today tend to date the development of the Pentateuch to the Persian period, a growing minority believes it was still in development during the Hellenistic period, after Alexander's conquest. Thomas L. Thompson has proposed that the dates and genealogies of Genesis are organized around a 4,000-year span that starts with creation and ends with the rededication of the temple under the Maccabees in 164 BCE, which would make the final Pentateuch a Hellenistic work regardless of its sources. In his 2000 book on the origins of the Bible, he writes, "The formation of biblical narrative was a process that created the Israel we know. It had its earliest roots in the period of Assyria's domination of Palestine. But the understanding of Israel we know from tradition first arose during the late Persian or early Hellenistic period, and was not fully developed before the time of the Maccabees." Niels Peter Lemke proposes that the biblical history of Israel mostly took shape under Seleucid rule during the 3rd century BC, based on the pervasive parallels between Old Testament narratives and Greek narratives, especially those of Herodotus. In one of his books, he remarks, "During this period, we can expect an interchange between Greek and Babylonian culture, much in the way we find a blending of traditions in the Old Testament." Our intent in this documentary has been to present an alternate hypothesis about the invention of Moses and the Exodus narrative, based on the work of several like-minded scholars. Frankly, we have no way of knowing the true origins of the character Moses. The earliest traditions about him, which survive in a small number of Bible passages and in the 4th century writings of the Greek historian Hecataeus of Abdera, are that he was a lawgiver and perhaps an Egyptian who founded Jerusalem and its temple, and who divided Israel into 12 tribes. Some of these facts might have originated as speculation by Hecataeus himself, based on similar legends and philosophical ideals about statehood. A few decades later, the Egyptian priest Manetho wrote a history containing 2 propagandistic stories about the Hexos, whom Manetho inaccurately describes as shepherd kings. His first story states that the Hexos founded Jerusalem after being driven out of Egypt. His second story states that the Hexos had returned many centuries later at the invitation of leprous priests and other polluted men who had been oppressed by King Amenophis. Together, the Hexos and the polluted men, who were followers of the god Seth Typhon, had carried out a reign of terror across Egypt. This story was not based in any historical reality, but was an analogy for the invasion of Persian King Artaxerxes III and a condemnation of the wicked Seth Typhon cult, which was by that time associated with foreigners. Manetho also knew of rumors in Egypt that connected the Jewish lawgiver Moses with Osiriseth, the leader of the leprous priests. A few more decades later, a Jewish writer living in Alexandria named Artapanus recounted a story of Moses and the Exodus that is lacking many of the details found in the Pentateuch about Moses' birth, the plagues, and the wilderness wandering. However, it includes an episode based on the Egyptian legend of Sesostris that portrays Moses as a brilliant leader and a military commander in Ethiopia who marries an Ethiopian wife. The Jews in Alexandria were aware of the tradition of Moses as their ancient lawgiver and founder of their homeland. They were also aware of the rumors associating the Judeans with the Hyksos and the polluted priests of Seth Typhon. They pushed back against this slander with their own story about how the Hebrews, not the Hyksos, were the shepherds who had been wrongly held captive by an Egyptian pharaoh until Moses led them to their home in Judea. Over the following years, this story was refined further to include other traditions, such as the Ethiopian wife, the encounter with deadly serpents, and a fairy tale-like birth story that reflects the well-known Hellenistic motif of a male child who is abandoned at birth, raised by another woman, and eventually reclaims his rightful position as a great leader. Disproving this hypothesis should be fairly simple, if not easy. A single monument about Moses' exploits from before the 4th century would do it. A single reference to the books of Moses among the thousands of Persian-era Jewish papyri from Elephantine would also be sufficient. But we cannot find what does not exist. If Moses is indeed a Hellenistic creation, then efforts to recover earlier sources are doomed to fail. In the meantime, you can count on MythVision to keep on pursuing the mysteries of the Bible and the origins of the Abrahamic religions.